Welcome to today's video on what is a theory. In this video, I'll demystify the concept of theory, what it is, why it matters, and how it comes alive in research on leadership, administration, and organizational behavior. Many of you are experienced leadership practitioners stepping into the world of leadership. You might be wondering, why all this fuss about theory? I want to solve the real problems. By the end of this video, you'll see that theory is not an ivory tower abstraction at all, but rather a very powerful tool, a map, a lens, and a scaffolding that can guide both of your research and your leadership practice. Let's get started. The term leadership is used in so many ways that it can become confusing, even meaningless if we're not careful. Sociologist Robert Merton warned decades ago that the word theory threatens to become meaningless because its references are so diverse, ranging from minor hypotheses to grand speculative frameworks. In today's language, people might say, I have a theory, when they really mean just a hunch or a guess. But in scholarly work, theory has a much more specific and rigorous meaning. What exactly is a theory in academic sense? Scholars have offered different definitions, each highlighting key aspects of what makes a theory more than just an idea. Let's consider a few influential definitions. A theory is a statement of relations among concepts within a set of boundary assumptions and constraints. It's no more than a linguistic device used to organize a complex empirical world. A collection of constructs and variables does not necessarily make a theory. In other words, a theory outlines how concepts or constructs relate to each other under certain conditions. Simply having a bunch of concepts is not enough. They must be woven together by relationships and context to count as a theory. A theory is a set of interrelated constructs or concepts, definitions, and propositions that present a systematic view of a phenomenon by specifying relations among variables with the purpose of explaining and predicting phenomena. This classic definition emphasizes that theory provides a systematic explanation. It not only describes what factors are important, but also how they fit together and why, which enables us to explain and predict outcomes. Well, Wetton didn't give a one-line definition. He explained that a complete theory must specify its building blocks, what factors or constructs are involved, how those factors are related, and why those relationships are expected. All of this framed by the who, where, and when conditions that set the theory's boundaries. In short, a theory should tell us what is happening, how it is happening, and why it is happening, under what circumstances it applied, and implicitly to whom. Sutton and Stahl famously wrote about what a theory is not. They caution that data, list of variables or diagrams and references are not theory by themselves. They imply that theory is the narrative or logic that ties together the evidence and variables into an explanation. Theory is essentially the answer to why. It examines underlying reasons and mechanisms rather than just stating facts or relationships. If you have a set of findings but cannot explain why they occur, you do not yet have a strong theory. Despite differences among those definitions, notice the common thread. Theory is about explaining phenomena by linking constructs in a coherent way under specified conditions. Theory is not just a wild guess, it's a structured explanation. It's not merely a diagram, it's not a literature review. This is something that I encounter very frequently when I read manuscripts as an associate editor at AERJ. Many of the manuscripts don't even have a section of theoretical framework, they only have a literature review. Back to the theory. Theory is not an isolated hypothesis, it's not a broad worldview. Those are relevant but distinct, as we will discuss later. Theory is the integrative explanation that makes science cumulative and findings meaningful beyond one study. It's helpful to distinguish theory from some closely related terms that we often encounter. Concepts. A concept is a broad general idea that originates from everyday language experience and philosophical traditions. Concepts are often pre-theoretical. They frame our thinking but remain open-ended, context-dependent, and semantically flexible. They help researchers explore what matters without requiring formal measurement. For example, terms like power and leadership function as concepts in both scholarly and public discourse, yet their meanings vary dramatically across cultural, historical, and situational contexts. In qualitative research, concepts are frequently used to interpret lived experience, generate meaning, or guide inquiry without the need for quantification. A construct, by contrast, is a concept that has been formally defined for the purpose of empirical research. Particularly in quantitative research, constructs are deliberately bounded and precise, designed to support systematic observation, comparison, and testing. Constructs must be operationalized, which means they are translated into observable indicators or measurable items, such as survey questions or behavioral codes. For example, the broad concept of motivation can be specified as distinct constructs like intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation, each with validated instruments that evaluate underlying dimensions. Constructs are operationalized as variables. Constructs enable researchers to quantify variation, test hypotheses, and build cumulative knowledge across studies. Constructs, therefore, serve as the building blocks of theory, but they do not alone constitute a theory. As Bararak noted, a collection of constructs does not constitute a theory. A theory must explain how those constructs relate to one another, why they are connected, when those relationships hold, and for whom. Constructs give us clarity and measurement potential. Theory gives us explanatory depth and predictive power. Models. The term model is sometimes used interchangeably with theory, but there is a subtle difference. Models are often simplified representations of reality. They can be physical, conceptual, or mathematical. In our context, a conceptual model usually means a diagram or description of how certain constructs may relate. All theories have underlying models, but not all models qualify as complete theories. A model may show that leadership style leads to employee performance, but without explaining why or under what conditions. It is an illustrative model, not a complete theory. Models are useful for visualization and for scoping a subset of reality, but a theory gives the deeper explanation. Frameworks. A framework is the structured scaffold that organizes key concepts, constructs, or variables relevant to a research problem. Although models often depict specific relationships, for example, the relationship between A and B, frameworks are broader. They map out what to consider, not necessarily how each part causally connects. A framework may integrate insights from multiple theories, empirical studies, or professional experience to orient the researcher's approach. In qualitative research, a conceptual framework helps guide inquiry and interpret findings. In quantitative research, a theoretical framework supports hypothesis testing by linking constructs with formal propositions. Importantly, frameworks do not need to offer causal claims. They serve as boundary maps, defining scope, identifying relevant domains, and clarifying assumptions. Although all theories rest on some kind of framework, not all framework rise to the level of theory because they may lack explanatory depth or predictive structure. Hypothesis. A hypothesis is not a theory. It's a proposition to be tested, usually about the relationship between two or a few variables. Hypotheses are derived from theories or frameworks. If a theory is a general explanation, hypotheses are specific predictions you can take to the field or lab to confirm or disconfirm parts of that theory. For example, based on a theory that leadership style influences employee motivation, you may hypothesize employees under a transformational leader will report higher motivation than those under a transactional leader. The hypothesis is testable in a particular study. The theory is broader. If the hypothesis consistently holds, it supports the theory's explanatory power. It is important to keep terms straight. A theory includes constructs, is often visualized by a model or embodied in a framework, and it yields specific hypotheses, but the theory itself is the bigger explanatory story. Building on the definitions of theory and other related terms, we can break down the core components that any strong theory should clarify. First, the what, the constructs. What are the key factors or variables a theory deals with? They are the constructs that the theory will connect. For example, in goal-setting theory, constructs include goal specificity, goal difficulty, commitment, and task performance. Clearly defining what you are talking about is the first step. Construct clarity ensures that the theory can be empirically tested and conceptually distinguished from related explanations. The how, the relationships. How are those constructs related? A theory should specify the nature of the relationships between constructs, whether they are causal, correlational, conditional, or interactive. For example, role theory proposes that role ambiguity and role conflict are negatively related to job performance and job satisfaction. That is, as ambiguity and conflict in one's role increases, performance and satisfaction tend to decrease. This relationship reflects a causal logic grounded in psychological strain and cognitive overload. The theory may also specify that role clarity moderates the relationship between job demands and outcomes, which highlights a more complex interaction. Those relationships are often stated as propositions at the theoretical level and become testable hypotheses when translated into specific variable in empirical research. The why, underlying mechanisms or logic. Perhaps most importantly, a theory must explain why those relationships are expected to hold. This is the theory's underlying logic or mechanism, the causal story or rationale. For example, why would conflicting demands from multiple supervisors lead to employee strain? Role theory explains that individuals experience stress when they face role conflict or role ambiguity, situations where expectations are inconsistent or unclear. The mechanism is that those unclear or incompatible expectations disrupt psychological functioning, erode confidence, and reduce task focus. The why is what gives a theory its explanatory power. It's the glue holding the what and the how together. Without a why, a proposed relationship feels ad hoc or coincidental. Sutton and Stahl emphasize that good theory is about articulating this why, the reasoning that makes the data or relationship intelligible. The who, where, when are the boundary conditions. Every theory has limits. It works under certain conditions and for certain contexts. These are the boundary conditions that tell us the scope of a theory. Does this theory apply to who? Individuals, teams, or organizations, leaders or followers? And where? In what context or culture? In terms of firms or in schools, in Western countries or globally? and when, in what time periods or stages. Perhaps it applies in early stage startups, but not in long-established organizations, or only in crisis versus stable times. A theory should acknowledge those boundaries. For example, a leadership theory developed in corporate settings may or may not hold in nonprofit organizations. If not, that is a boundary condition, explicitly stating when a theory applies and when it may not. It's a part of theoretical clarity. Unfortunately, theorists often do not state their boundary conditions clearly, which can lead to misusing theories in the wrong context. Assumptions. Underlying values or actor assumptions. Underlying all of the what, how, why, who, where, and when, theories carry assumptions, often implicit assumptions about how the world works or about the actors in the theory. For example, many economic management theories assume rational actors, individuals who aim to maximize utility, meaning they make decisions that optimize their personal benefit based on stable preferences and complete information. By contrast, many psychological or political theories may assume bounded rationality, where decisions are constrained by limited information, cognitive biases, or social and institutional pressures. Those foundational assumptions shape both the structure of the theory and its limits of applicability. An important part of engaging with theory is to ask, what assumptions does it make about human nature, organizational purpose, or environmental conditions? For example, does the theory assume a closed system where the organization operates in a relatively stable, predictable environment with minimal external disruption? Or does it accommodate an open, chaotic system where organizations are constantly influenced by shifting political, technological, and cultural forces, which makes organizational outcomes less controllable and linear models less effective? Sometimes it's hard to wrap our head around theory in the abstract. So let's use a few visual metaphors to illustrate the role of theory. Theory as a map. Imagine theory as a map of complex territory. The territory could be leadership in organizations, for example. Without a map, we wander, making observations. Oh, look, here is a hill, there is a river, but we might get lost in details. A theory, like a good map, highlights the major landmarks, which are key constructs, and the roads and routes between them, which are relationships. It's a simplified representation, just as a map is not an actual terrain. A theory is not reality, it's an abstraction. But a map helps us navigate new terrain by indicating what to observe, what to expect, and how things connect. Importantly, every map has edges and scales. It may be a city map or a world map. Likewise, every theory has boundaries of scope. Using the wrong theory is like using a city map to navigate a whole country. You will miss the bigger picture. Using the right theory map can guide you to your destination, which is understanding or solving a problem. You can solve your problems much more efficiently than wandering without the theory map. Theory as a lens. Theory can also be seen as a lens that focuses our vision. Consider how a pair of colored glasses can tint what you see. A theory does something similar. It allows you to see certain patterns sharply, but it can also filter out other details. For example, if you put on the transformational leadership lens, you start seeing leadership in terms of inspiration, charisma, and intellectual stimulation. But if you put on a bureaucratic lens, you start seeing organizations in terms of hierarchy and rules. This is why in academic writing, we often say theory A and B serve as a theoretical lens to explain phenomenon C. In the example of a transformational leadership lens and bureaucratic lens, neither lens shows the whole picture. Each lens highlights certain elements while downplaying others. That's why we have multiple theories, like having multiple pairs of glasses, each offering a different perspective on the same phenomenon. A skilled researcher or practitioner knows how to switch lenses or even use more than one to get a richer view. The lens metaphor reminds us that theory is interpretive. It shapes what we notice, how we explain what we see. It can also inadvertently blind us to things our chosen theory does not account for. Therefore, we should be aware of which lens we are wearing and their assumptions and boundary conditions. Theory as scaffolding. Think of scaffolding used in construction, a temporary structure that helps builders reach higher and give form to a building as it's being built. Theory in research is like scaffolding for knowledge. When you undertake a research study, you erect a theoretical framework, which is the scaffold to support your inquiry. It helps you decide what data to collect, what relationship to investigate, and how to interpret results. As evidence accumulates, that scaffolded theory can be strengthened, modified, or in some cases removed if the building, which is your empirical finding, can stand on its own, or if a better scaffold, which is a theory, is needed for the next level. In practice, scaffolding is also about supporting action. If you have a theory guiding a project or intervention, it provides a structure which ensures you are not just randomly trying things. For example, in designing a leadership development program, a theoretical scaffold, such as adult learning theory combined with leadership identity theory, helps practitioners structure learning experiences intentionally. Adult learning theory emphasizes that adults learn best when content is relevant, experiential, self-directed, and problem-centered. Leadership identity theory, in turn, focuses on how individuals internalize and develop a sense of themselves as leaders over time, particularly through social interactions and reflective practices. When used together, the two theories inform how to sequence activities, for example, experiential learning, peer feedback, leadership narratives, so that leadership trainees are not just gaining skills, but actively restructuring their identity as leaders. Without such scaffolding, a leadership development program might consist of disconnected events that fail to produce desirable outcomes. The scaffold metaphor underscores that theory supports and structures our effort to build knowledge, but theory can be adjusted and even dismantled as we refine our understanding, just as scaffolding is moved as construction progresses. Each metaphor, map, lens, scaffold, captures a facet of what theory does for us. A map guides us through complexity, a lens sharpens and filters our view, and a scaffold supports the construction of new knowledge. You may find one metaphor resonates with you more than others. Take a moment to consider which metaphor for theory do you find most helpful for understanding its role. How might theory serve that function in your own research? Before moving on, let's drive home a key point. Theory is not the enemy of practice. It is a tool to enhance your leadership practices. In fact, one of the most famous maxims in social science comes from psychologist Kurt Lewin, who said, "There is nothing so practical as a good theory." A good theory is practical because it helps us explain why things happen and predict outcomes, meaning we can be more effective leaders if our behaviors and actions are informed by good theories. With that in mind, let's explore why theory really matters, especially for those of you aiming to make an impact in your professional settings. If you come from a professional background, you may feel some skepticism about theory. Perhaps you've heard colleagues saying things like, "In the real world, we need solutions, not theories," or "Theory is too abstract to be useful on the ground." It's a fair concern. On the surface, academic theories can sometimes appear disconnected from day-to-day challenges. As an experienced leader or administrator, you may rely on intuition and experience more than formal theory. So, why are we insisting that you engage deeply with theory? Because most theories are not good theories. Many fail to specify basic elements, what they're describing, why the phenomenon occurs, how it unfolds, when it matters, and for whom it works. Without those basic components, an underdeveloped theory lacks both clarity and utility, which means the practical value. But when a theory does articulate those components with theoretical precision, it becomes a practical tool. It explains, predicts, and guides your leadership practice. And as scholar practitioners in the leadership field, your task is not only to use good theories, but also to identify, refine, and even replace weak theories. Leadership practitioners often rely on personal experience or case-specific knowledge. In my last project or in my organization, doing X worked well. That kind of experiential wisdom is valuable, but it's also limited. Will X work well in a different department, with a different team, under different constraints? One common issue I see in doctoral students is an over-reliance on their immediate professional context. For example, if they work in Department A of Organizational B, they tend to design research that applies only to that precise setting. When I challenge them to think more broadly, what might your findings mean for leadership more generally? Some students pushed back. They felt I was dismissing their professional expertise. But that's not the case. The issue is this: it's highly unlikely they will stay in that same role in Department A for the rest of their career. Once they move to Department C in Organization D, their context changes, and what worked before may no longer apply. For example, the goal in Department A may have been to improve teacher retention in a high-turnover urban school, and their strategies were tailored accordingly, perhaps focused on mentorship, workload support, or recognition. But if they move to Department C, which operates in a rural school district or an urban district but in a different county or different state, where the goal is to implement instructional leadership to meet federal compliance mandates, the leadership challenge shifts entirely. The familiar playbook that you developed in a different setting may become obsolete. They may find themselves unprepared and unsure of how to diagnose or recognize new problems. That is why in doctoral programs, I challenge my students to think outside of their immediate organizational roles and to frame their inquiries in ways that contribute to broader theoretical and practical conversations in the field. This does not mean ignoring the realities of practice. It means elevating your insights so you can inform leadership thinking across multiple contexts and contingencies. Leadership is not about replicating context-specific tactics. It's about understanding the underlying dynamics that motivate a group of people toward a shared goal. That requires theoretical tools that travel across contexts, which allows you to make sense of new environments, adapt strategically, and lead effectively amid complexity and change. A good theory gives us more confidence to generalize and predict outcomes in new settings. Theory distills lessons from many cases, abstracting them to a level where they can guide future situations. For example, you may have observed that recognition improves employee motivation in your team. But is that generally true? Self-determination theory or expectancy theory, both of which you will learn in this semester, would predict that recognition boosts motivation when it aligns with that individual's psychological needs or outcome expectancies. If an employee highly values verbal affirmation and social acknowledgement, a public shout out in front of the entire team is likely to enhance that employee's motivation more effectively than a financial bonus if it does not resonate with the employee's core values or expectations. A theory does not just confirm that recognition works, it helps explain why it works, for whom, and under what conditions. That's the power of theory. It motivates us beyond anecdotes and personal experience to more robust, transferable insights. The theory, therefore, allows you to predict if those conditions are present in another team or organization. Recognition should similarly boost employee motivation there. It also warns you if key conditions change, the outcome may be different because the prediction is bounded by the context. The ability to move from the particular to the general and to know the limits of that generalization is critical in research and your leadership practice when you aim to produce knowledge that others can use, not just a one-off solution. Now I want to acknowledge a concern. Sometimes the theories from academia do feel too broad or idealized to apply in real life. This is where your expertise as a leadership practitioner comes in. You adapt and contextualize theories. You may blend multiple theories to fit a complex situation or use theory as a general guide rather than a strict formula. Theory is not a cage, it's a guidepost. The key takeaway is ignoring theory together deprives you of insight that can save you time and improve outcomes. Kurt Levin's maximum bears repeating. There is nothing so practical as a good theory. Why? Because a good theory encodes lots of real-world experience and evidence into a form that we can transfer to new situations. Think about a challenge you've faced in your professional practice. Could a theory have helped illuminate why that challenge arose and how to address it? For example, if you dealt with high staff turnover, could self-determination theory or equity theory have given insights? If a project failed due to team issues, could team composition theory have explained what happened? Taking a moment to make that connection can show the practical value of theory in retrospect and prepare you to use theory proactively in the future. With the importance of theory in mind, let's turn to some examples. We'll see how specific theories in leadership, management, administration, and organizational science have been applied and how they add value compared to a-theoretical approaches. Those examples will ground all this abstract talk in real-world scenarios. To illustrate the power of theory, we'll look at a few well-known theories in the domains of leadership and organization and contrast them with what a more ad hoc approach might look like. I'll cover 4 examples: transformational theory, path goal theory, institutional theory, and leader-member exchange. As I discuss each of them, notice how the theory provides the what, how, why, and when, and think about how using that theory can shape your research and leadership practice differently than not using any theory at all. First, transformational leadership. If you've taken any leadership courses, you've likely heard of transformational leadership, introduced by James MacGregor Burns in the political context and later expanded by Bernard Bass for organizations. This theory explains how certain leaders can inspire and transform followers to achieve higher performance and personal growth. What are the key concepts? Transformational leadership is defined by a cluster of leader behaviors and attributes. Classic literature breaks down into 4 I's, sometimes 5 components. Idealized influence, that is, the leader's charisma and moral example, which earns trust and admiration. Bass actually split this into attributed charisma and behavioral charisma. That's why sometimes you'll hear people say transformational leadership has 5 components instead of 4. The second component is inspirational motivation, the leader's ability to articulate a compelling vision and motivate followers to pursue it. The third component is intellectual stimulation. The leader challenges assumptions, encourages creativity, and nurtures innovation in followers. And the fourth component is individualized consideration. The leader mentors and attends to each follower's needs and development. How do those constructs relate? The transformational leadership theory posits that by exhibiting those leader behaviors, a leader transforms the norms and motivations of followers. Followers trust the leader, feels inspired, think outside of the box, and feel individually valued. As a result, outcomes like follower satisfaction, commitment, and performance improve. So the relationship include transformational leadership behaviors leads to higher follower motivation and capacity, which then leads to better organizational outcomes. Why does this happen? The underlying mechanisms include things like emotional engagement. The vision and the charisma emotionally inspire people to invest in work. Value congruence, leaders' ideals resonate and elevate followers' own goals. Intellectual engagement, challenging tasks and new ideas stimulate growth, and personal support, individual coaching builds confidence and competence. Those psychological mechanisms explain why transformational leadership can lead to extraordinary effort from followers. It changes how followers see themselves and their work. For example, from just a job to a mission. When, where, and who does it apply? Transformational leadership theory was initially studied in business and military organizations, but it's being applied widely from educational institutions to nonprofits and across cultures. It tends to be considered more universally applicable, but context still matters. For example, in a very crisis-driven situation, a combination of transformational, which is visionary, and transactional, which is stabilizing and reward-focused leadership, may be needed. Cultural context may influence what aspects are most effective. For example, idealized influence may manifest differently in collectivist versus individualist cultures. The transformational leadership theory assumes leaders at any level can display those behaviors, though often it is associated with higher level leaders orchestrating major change. How to apply the transformational leadership theory? Consider an organization undergoing major change, new strategy, reorganization. An a-theoretical approach might be the top leader, for example, CEO in a company or a superintendent in a school district, communicates some changes, maybe offers some bonuses and hopes for the best. If morale drops or people resist, they react with ad hoc fixes. By contrast, a leader informed by transformational leadership theory will proactively create a vision for the change, communicate it passionately, inspirational motivation, model the change values themselves, idealize the influence, challenge teams to find creative solutions during the transition, intellectual stimulation, and personally check in with the key employees to address their concerns, individualized consideration. Research guided by this theory would measure those behaviors and track outcomes like employment, engagement, innovation, and performance. Indeed, studies have shown transformational leadership correlates with higher follower motivation and performance in many contexts. The theory has added value by turning a nebulous idea of good leadership into specific behaviors and testable propositions. Without it, leadership development may still be just charisma or instincts. With theory, we have a framework to train and evaluate the leader systematically. Our second example is another leadership theory, but from an earlier era of research, path-goal theory. Originally developed by Robert House, path-goal theory is rooted in expectancy theory of motivation. It tries to explain how leaders can motivate followers to achieve goals by clarifying the path to those goals and removing obstacles. What are the main constructs in the path-goal theory? The theory identifies leader behaviors, which includes 4 styles and contingency factors in the environment, which together influence employee outcomes like satisfaction and performance. The leader behavior styles are directive, given direct instruction, setting expectations; supportive, showing concern for employees' well-being; participative, inviting input in decision-making; and achievement-oriented, setting challenging goals and encouraging high performance. On the follower environment side, key factors include the nature of the task, structured or unstructured task, the formal authority system, and follower characteristics like experience and perceived ability. How do those constructs relate? The core idea is that the leader's job is to adjust their style to complement the environment and meet followers' needs, thereby clearing the path for followers to achieve their goal, hence the path goal. For example, if the task is ambiguous and the followers are inexperienced, which is part of the contingencies, a directive style clarifying task, providing guidance, is predicted to improve followers' effort and satisfaction because it reduces ambiguity. If tasks are repetitive or stressful, a supportive style, friendly, approachable leader behaviors should improve satisfaction by boosting morale. Participative leadership works well when followers are capable and want involvement. Their input improves decisions and they feel valued. Achievement-oriented leadership, pushing for excellence, may work when tasks are complex but followers are committed. It can challenge them to reach higher levels. Why does path-goal theory matter? Underneath, path-goal theory borrows from expectancy theory. Followers are motivated if they expect that their effort will lead to performance, path clarity, and that performance will lead to desired rewards or outcomes, goal attractiveness. A leader influences the expectancy by removing roadblocks and providing support. So effort leads to performance is credible and influences valence by tying rewards or work itself to what followers value. So performance leads to reward is desirable. Essentially, the leader fills the gap. If the task is dull, the leader may make outcomes more rewarding. If the path is unclear, the leader clarifies it. The why is that by doing so, the leader increases the followers' motivational belief that if I can do this, it will be worth it. The when and where. It assumes leaders can adapt their style flexibly. In reality, not all leaders can. It's most applicable in work settings where a leader has authority to change their approach and where follower satisfaction performance issues may stem from task or work design issues. It may be less relevant in extremely structured environment where leaders have no flexibility or discretion, but it's being tested in different environments from office teams to industrial settings with mixed support. Some aspects often hold while others less so, which leads to later refinement of the theory. How to apply the path-goal theory? Imagine a scenario. A team's performance is flagging. An atheoretical leader may try a one-size-fits-all approach, perhaps sending a stern email, which is directive, or offer bonus, which is achievement-oriented, and see what sticks. If that doesn't work, they're puzzled. A leader applying path-goal theory would first evaluate, are my team members clear on their team goals and methods? If not, use a directive approach to clarify that path. Are they demoralized due to reason X? If yes, use a supportive approach to boost performance and morale. Are they experienced and wanting more autonomy? If yes, use a participative approach to invite them in improving team's strategy. Perhaps the goals feel out of reach, then achievement-oriented coaching can encourage them that the goal is attainable with effort and provide small wins along the way. By tailoring the approach, the leader addresses the root motivational issues rather than guessing. Research using path goal theory may measure those constructs, task structure, leader style, follower satisfaction to see if, for example, supportive leadership indeed has a bigger impact on satisfaction for employee in boring, routine jobs. The theory would predict yes. Without path goal theory, early leadership studies found inconsistent effects of leader behaviors on outcomes. With the path goal theory, we understood that the effectiveness of a given style depends on the situation, which is a key insight for contingency theories of leadership. Shifting from individual leadership to the organizational level, let's talk about institutional theory. This comes from organizational sociology, and it explains why organizations often end up looking and acting very similarly, sometimes independent of their actual effectiveness. It is a powerful theoretical lens for management and organizational science, especially in understanding organizational change and persistence of some practices. What are the main constructs in institutional theory? At the core, we have the construct of institutional environment, the norms, rules, beliefs, and expectations in the broader context that organizations operate in. Key constructs include institutional pressure of three types: coercive, normative, and mimetic pressure, organizational practices and structure, and legitimacy. Coercive pressure comes from regulation or resource dependencies, for example, government mandates or requirements by powerful stakeholders. Normative pressures come from professional norms and values, what good practice is according to industry or professional bodies. Mimetic pressures come from uncertainty. When not sure what to do, organizations imitate peers or leaders in the field, which is the everyone else is doing it effect. Legitimacy is the perceived appropriateness or credibility an organization gains by conforming to institutional norms. How do those constructs relate? Institutional theory posits that organizations adopt structures and practices not just for the efficiency, but to gain or maintain legitimacy by aligning with institutional expectations. So the relationships are stronger. Institutional pressure leads to more homogeneity in organizational forms and practices, which then leads to organizations gain legitimacy and thus stability or survival by conforming. Sometimes this leads to decoupling. Another concept, an organization may ceremonially adopt a policy to appear legit, but not actually implement it fully, which maintains separate formal structure for show and informal practices for work. For example, an organization may announce adherence to a professional standard, which is the formal structure, but internally not change much, which is the actual practice. The institutional theory explains such gaps as the result of needing to appear legitimate without sacrificing efficiency. Why does it apply? The why is rooted in social and cognitive needs. Organizations are run by people who want acceptance, resources, and stability. If society or powerful actors expect organizations to have, let's say, a chief innovation officer or department of data-driven decision-making, then organizations will adopt them to signal that they are modern, responsible, good organizations, even if the direct impact of having chief innovation officer or department of data-driven decision-making is unclear. The why is legitimacy. Adhering to institutions ensures the organization is not penalized or shunned. It may gain trust of the public or support from the state. Another why is uncertainty reduction. If no one knows the best way to do something, for example, a new technology implementation, copying other organizations' practices will make a leader feel safer. It's rational from a legitimacy standpoint. Nobody gets fired by following the so-called good practices. Over time, this mimicry and norms solidify into taken for granted rules. For example, the idea that an organization should have certain hierarchy, even if those don't immediately increase organizational performance. When and where does it apply? Institutional theory is most applicable in environments where external expectations strongly impact organizations. Education, healthcare, government, and highly regulated industries are classic examples. For example, schools often adopt similar curricula or policies because of federal guidelines, which is coercive pressure, or because everybody in education is talking about this new approach, which is the normative or mimetic pressure. It also applies to industries with professional standards, like accounting firms adopting the same ethical codes due to professional associations, which is normative pressure. It may be less explanatory in a truly free market context with no regulations or shared norms, if such a thing exists. But in reality, almost all organizations face institutional pressure of some kind. Even startups imitate the Silicon Valley model of open offices and agile startups. That's institutional mimicry. The institutional theory was originally articulated in the late 70s and 80s when scholars observed that organizations often implement similar structures like formal HR departments and quality certifications, regardless of whether those actually improve performance. So that suggests something beyond pure efficiency was at work. How to apply institutional theory? Let's say you observe a puzzling phenomenon. A wave of organizations all suddenly appoint a chief innovation officer. And a theoretical observer may list reasons like maybe they will care about motivation now, or it's a trend. But it remains a little bit puzzling if not all of those organizations actually change their practices much. No new innovation metrics, just a new title on the organizational chart. Institutional theory offers a richer explanation. Coercive pressure may be at play. Perhaps regulatory bodies or funding sources are nudging organizations to demonstrate a formal commitment to innovation. Normative pressure could also be at work. Leadership preparation programs now turn out the people who are trained to believe innovation strategy is essential, and the consultants frame the chief innovation officer role as a modern best practice. And of course, there is mimetic pressure. Organization A sees that organizations B and C got glowing press coverage after appointing a chief innovation officer, so they follow suit not to fall behind. Research using institutional theory would gather data on those pressures, track innovation policy statements, professional association rhetoric, or LinkedIn hiring waves, and analyze how they correlate with the timing of those chief innovation officer appointments. We may find that, indeed, the rise of the chief innovation officer is less about sudden performance imperative and more about a legitimacy arms race. By contrast, an atheoretical study may only look for a rational reason, say, does hiring a chief innovation officer increase organizational performance? And if the answer is no, people may simply scratch their head. Actually, many new researchers fall into this pattern. They ask questions like, Does program A, which is often something they implemented or championed in their own professional setting, improve outcome B, which is usually the local metric they already use at work? The problem is not that the question is unimportant. Again, I'm not dismissing your professional expertise. It's that those kind of research questions assume a direct causal relationship without asking why the program exists, how it came to be institutionalized, and under what conditions its effect might vary. The a-theoretical approach reduces leadership practice to a technical fix, which strips out the social, political, and symbolic dimensions that institutional theory helps illuminate. The added value of using institutional theory here is that it helps leaders understand that sometimes you adopt practices because you have to be taken seriously, and it warns researchers that best practices may spread for reasons other than proven effectiveness. This opens the door to a deeper set of research questions. Are we appointing a chief innovation officer because it is strategically necessary, or because we don't want to be the last organization without one? Think about management and leadership fads. Many are propelled more by mimicry and consultant hype than rigorous evidence. This can spur critical questions. Are we doing X because it works, or because of social pressure? For the last example, I'll highlight leader-member exchange theory, which looks at leadership at the dyadic level, the one-on-one relationship between a leader and each follower. Leader-member exchange theory is a little bit different from broad leadership style theories. Remember, leadership style is a pattern of leader behaviors. Leader-member exchange theory emerged from the observation that leaders often develop different relationships with each subordinate. Some relationships are high quality, trusting, and supportive, and others are low quality, formal, and distant. This theory is especially relevant to understanding team dynamics and fairness. What are the constructs in leader-member exchange theory? The key constructs are relationship quality, which is the leader-member exchange itself, often measured by respect, trust, and mutual obligation. The in-group versus out-group status and various outcomes such as job performance, satisfaction, and turnover. Early leader-member exchange research described in-group members high leader-member exchange, who get more responsibility, support, and trust from the leader, versus out-group members, low leader-member exchange, who get a more standard transactional relationship. How do those constructs relate? The theory posits that high-quality exchange between leader and member leads to better outcomes. Those members often perform better, go above and beyond, report higher satisfaction, and are less likely to quit. Why? Because they receive more mentoring, more information, and feel valued. And in return, they're more committed and willing to go the extra mile for the leader. Low quality exchange results in doing just the bare minimum. Those members are less engaged and may feel overlooked or unfairly treated, which leads to lower performance or higher turnover. A leader's differential treatment therefore creates internal team dynamics that can influence group performance as well. If an out-group feels resentful, that can hurt team cohesion. Why does this team dynamics occur? Leader-member exchange theory's why is rooted in social exchange theory. Relationships evolve based on mutual exchange and trust. When a leader first meets a subordinate, small interactions determine if they build trust. Perhaps the subordinate shows initiative and the leader responds with more responsibility, which starts a positive cycle. Or maybe an early miscommunication leads to the leader keeping distance, which creates a negative cycle. Over time, those initial biases can solidify into stable, high or low leader-member exchange relationships. Psychologically, being in the leader's in-group increases an employee's sense of support and obligation. Being in the out group can lead to disengagement and perception of organizational injustice, which is the subordinates' perception that they are being treated unfairly, excluded from opportunities, and denied access to resources and recognition given to others. Leader-member exchange theory also explicitly draws a boundary condition of time. Early stages of a leader-member relationship are critical. This is when the role-making happens that set the tone. When and where does leader-member exchange apply? It's relevant in almost any organizations where leaders oversee multiple people and have to allocate time and resources among them. It highlights a micro level of leadership that other theories like transformational leadership did not explicitly address. You can be a transformational leader generally, but you may still have favorites versus others in your team without realizing. The leader-member exchange theory gained traction by pointing out this variability in the team. It assumes that leaders have some discretion to treat people differently, so perhaps less applicable in highly unionized or very uniform processes where you must treat everyone the same by policy. It's culturally dependent as well. Some organizational culture expect leaders to treat everyone uniformly, so leader-member exchange differentials may be viewed negatively as favoritism, whereas other cultures accept that closer relationships with some are natural. How to apply leader-member exchange theory? Consider an administrator with a team of 10 people. An atheoretical approach to study this team may look at the administrator's overall style or the team's average engagement. But a researcher using leader-member exchange theory would examine each diet. Maybe Alice has a great rapport with the administrator that is high leader-member exchange. They chat often. Alice gets plum assignments. Whereas Bob has a chilly relationship that is low leader-member exchange, strictly task-focused interactions, no extras. Even if the administrator verbally expresses a fair leadership philosophy, in practice, those differences emerge. Leader-member exchange theory-driven research would predict Alice will have higher performance and loyalty, whereas Bob may be doing bare minimum and eyeing the exit. From a practical perspective, a leader aware of leader-member exchange theory may diagnose their team. Have I inadvertently created an in-group and out-group? How can I bring Bob into a better exchange? Without the leader-member exchange theory, an administrator may not even notice they're given more opportunities to some people than others. They may just think Alice is awesome, Bob is average, and not realize their behavior is reinforcing that pattern. But measuring leader-member exchange quality, there are instruments for that. A leader can become aware and intervene, maybe consciously spend more one-on-one time with those in the out group to build trust. This can lead to more effective leadership and better overall team performance. Leader-member exchange theory added value to leadership studies by explaining intra-team variations and highlighting fairness and relationship building as central to leadership effectiveness, sometimes a generalized leadership style theory would not capture. In each example I've already shared, we saw that having a theoretical lens are important. Transformational leadership theory helped identify specific behaviors that differentiate truly inspiring leaders from average ones, and thereby giving practitioners a recipe for development. Try to improve on those 4 I's. Without transformational leadership, one may just label a leader great without knowing what made them so. Path goal theory highlighted that leadership effectiveness depends on context. Without path goal theory, early leadership studies found contradictory studies. One study said directive leadership works, another says it does not. The theory reconciled those findings by introducing situational variables. Institutional theory uncovered the social pressure and norms driving organizational behavior beyond rational efficiency. And a theoretical view may wrongly assume every practice is adopted because it's optimal, which misses the role of culture, law, and imitation. And the leader-member exchange theory shined a light on relationship quality and fairness in teams, which promotes both research and leaders to pay attention to how subordinates may experience very different leadership even under the same leader. Across the board, the theory adds explanatory depth and helps generalize knowledge. Studies that lack theory may still gather useful data, but they often end up being descriptive or isolated. They tell a story of what happened here, but give little guidance for what will happen elsewhere and why it happened. By contrast, studies anchored in theory contribute to a cumulative body of knowledge. Each study refines the theory, which in turn can be used by others. For you as researchers in training, seeing those examples hopefully illustrate how using theory can sharpen your research questions and your interpretation of the research findings. If you study, say, a new leadership development program in your organization, doing it with theory, perhaps using transformational leadership or adult learning theory as a theoretical base, will help you identify which outcomes to look for, why it should work, and how to measure success. And your findings will inform not just your organization, but anyone interested in that theory. Doing it without theory may still tell you if the theory worked, but you and others may not learn anything generalizable from it. For example, was it the coaching element or the feedback element that mattered? Theory would have guided you to test those components based on expectation. As a brief exercise, you can try to identify one theory relevant to a dissertation topic or workplace problem and ask, how would this theory guide my approach differently than if I had no theory at all? We'll come back to those reflections. There is one more important dimension to discuss, a more philosophical one. We've been treating theory as a tool or product that researchers create. But where do those theories come from? Why do certain theories become popular? This leads us to some meta-theoretical discussions. Up to now, we've talked about theory in a straightforward way, as if it's an objective thing, a tool for explanation that gradually improves as evidence accumulates. Well, that is one aspect. It's also important to recognize that theory itself is a human product shaped by social and historical forces. In the research journey, especially in fields like leadership and organizational studies, it's important to step back and critically consider the bigger picture of theory making. Whose knowledge counts as theory? Not all knowledge gets codified into theory. Often what we recognize as theories in textbooks comes from academic scholars, usually in Western institutions, publishing in journals. But consider experienced practitioners carry a wealth of knowledge, yet we rarely call that theory. Sometimes it may be called tacit knowledge or best practices. Similarly, non-Western cultures have rich conditions of understanding leadership or community that do not always get formalized in mainstream theory. Historically, there have been imbalances. For example, early management theories came from Western industrial contexts. Taylor's scientific management in U.S. factories, Weber's bureaucracy from observing Western bureaucracies, and reflected those values. Feminist scholars have pointed out that many leadership theories were developed by men and often overlooked gender dynamics until more women entered the field. So one may ask, are there voices and perspectives not captured in the dominant theories? Who has the power to define what is a theory? In recent years, there is a push for more inclusive theories. For example, indigenous leadership theories or African-centered leadership theories, which acknowledges that mainstream theory has blind spots. What theories get institutionalized and why? This question itself is ironically a use of institutional theory on the academic field. Certain theories become popular or widely taught. It could be because they have strong explanatory power, or it could be because they were championed by influential scholars. For example, agency theory from economics about principles and agents become incredibly influential in management in the 1980s and 90s, which aligned with a broader neoliberal emphasis on stakeholder value. On the other hand, other critical perspectives stayed more on the fringes of mainstream management journals, perhaps because they clashed with dominant ideologies or methods. What is considered a canonical theory is partly a result of social processes, conferences, journals, citation networks, and academic politics, not just pure merit of the theories. The field of leadership, administration, and organizational science itself has a lot of trends and fashions. For example, the trait theories of leadership focus on leaders' innate traits were popular in early 20th century, then fell out of favor mid-century in favor of behavioral and situational theories, only to be revived later in new forms like emotional intelligence, which was a trait coming back in vogue. Why? Partly new evidence, but partly changes in what we value and what method we have. The advent of personality psychological measurement brought trait theories back. Theories are often products of their time. If you look at when a theory emerged, you often see the imprint of historical context. Scientific Management by Frederick Taylor in the early 20th century came during industrialization's peak. It's all about efficiency, standardization, control, which reflected the factory system needs. Human relations theory by Alton Mayo and colleagues in the 1930s emerged after workers' strikes and the Great Depression. Suddenly, managers cared about workers' sentiment and morale, so theories about social needs at work gained traction. In the 1960s and 70s, amid social change and a more educated workforce, theories of participation, job enrichment, and transformational leadership roles, which value individual growth and purpose. Understanding this reminds us that theories are not internal truths. They adapt and get supplemented as the context changes. It also empowers you as a scholar practitioner. Your context today might give birth the next theory. For example, how is the digital age and remote work change leadership theory needs? Perhaps existing theories do not fully address leading through virtual teams. That gap could be your opportunity to develop and extend theory. Finally, consider the social process of theory building. It's not solitary geniuses in an attic. It's a community effort. Theories get debated at conferences, refined in journals, sometimes discarded or merged. It can be a contentious process. Scholars have rival theories and accumulate evidence for them, sometimes creating academic camps. Understanding this social aspect of theory building will help you navigate literature review. You will see, Theory A and Theory B are two schools of thought on the same issue, and you can position your work in relation to them. As a teaser, think about how technology today, especially artificial intelligence, may be driving new theories. For example, the gig economy has challenged traditional employment theories. Scholars are now formulating theories about what motivates gig workers, how identity plays out when someone is an Uber driver one day and an Airbnb host the next, or how social media used by leaders, which is a very modern phenomenon, ties into leadership theory. Is it symbolic leadership, narrative leadership, there are researchers who are now constructing theories to make sense of those new realities. In sum, theory is not static, it's a living discourse. Being part of a research community, you are now invited into that discourse, not just to learn existing theories, but to question them, test them, and possibly build new ones. It's an exciting and, yes, sometimes messy endeavor. But remember, the goal of all this theory work is ultimately to better understand and improve your leadership practice. Now, to conclude, let's turn this back to you and your work. A doctoral program is not just about absorbing what others have done, it's about applying and eventually extending theory yourself. Here are a couple of short exercises or reflection to solidify your learning and connect it to your research interest. First, take a moment to consider your own doctoral research topic or a problem you are passionate about exploring. What theory or theories may be relevant to it? If you are not sure, think of the core phenomena in your topic. For example, employee engagement in remote teams, or decision-making in school leadership, or technology adoption in hospitals. If you are uncertain about which theories to consider, start with the Game of Theories series I created to introduce major theories in leadership, administration, and organizational science. Now ask, have scholars studied something similar, and what theories did they use to explain it? Identify at least one theory that could provide a lens for your study. Write down the theory's name, one key construct it offers for your topic, and why you think it might be a good explanation for what you want to investigate. If you find more than one theory fits, list them. Sometimes combining different theoretical lenses is fruitful. This exercise will help you begin framing your study in theoretical terms and may highlight which aspects of your problem are most important and which theories resonate with those aspects. Second, think of a specific challenge or scenario from your professional experience. It could be anything, perhaps improving team communication during a crisis or improve team performance in Project A. Now, consider how looking at this problem from a theoretical lens could change your approach. For example, if I pick improving team communication in a crisis, I may recall situational leadership theory, which suggests leaders should adjust style in high-pressure contexts, or perhaps sense-making theory, which says in crisis, people need help interpreting what is happening. With one of those theories in mind, how would you reframe the problem and possible solutions? Write down a few insights. Maybe you recognize, in a crisis, according to theory, people need a new vision. That is what transformational leadership would say. So I should focus on providing that. Or sense-making theory reminds me that everyone is confused, so I should create forums for the team to collectively make sense of events. The goal of this exercise is to experience the shift in your thinking that theories can provide, from an ambiguous problem to a more structured diagnosis and action plan. By engaging in those reflections, you are taking a step toward being a scholar practitioner, someone who can fluidly move between theory and practice, which enriches each with the other. Keep your notes. Those could be C's for your literature review or even your theoretical framework chapter in your dissertation.